Hi, my name is Christian Alexander. I would like to tell you about the brief history of the Near South Side in the city of Chicago, as well as how the ethnicities and races have changed over the years, from the early mid-1800s to today, the 2000s. The very first settlers that arrived here were the Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians. At first, they worked on the Illinois and Michigan channels and then moved to working in the lumber yards. All of this occurred before the 1800s. Train stations got built next to the lumber yards and factories to help move supplies and finished products to the marketplace during the 1850s. Chicago's wealthy would create mansions such as the John J. Glessner House, as shown by the picture. The prime location for these houses was Prairie Avenue. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago, quote, "By the time of the Chicago Fire of 1871, Prairie Avenue was the city's most fashionable street," end quote. Unfortunately, there were two fires in Chicago, one in 1871 and another in 1874. Despite the great loss that the fires caused, they, in general, were beneficial to the city because they gave Chicago a chance to rebuild and replan. The Near South Side was fortunately not affected by the fires directly, but rather indirectly. All the businesses that had previously existed elsewhere now moved into the Near South Side and turned this section of the city into a business district. After becoming a business district, apartments and housing began to appear primarily during 1890 to 1892 in preparation for the World's Columbian Exposition the following year, in 1893. This exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was a great way for the residents to see what the world had to offer to them. This was most likely a pull factor because the Near South Side hosted an event where the attendees got to see what life was like elsewhere. After World War I, the African Americans moved to the Near South Side to find work. Because of this, the population moved a little further south to around Kenwood. Furthermore, parks were created on landfills such as Burnham Park and adjacent Northerly Island. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago Online, quote, "During the 1920s and 1930s, Burnham Park and adjacent Northerly Island were created on landfills in Lake Michigan, and the Field Museum of Natural History, Soldier Field, the Alder Planetarium, and the John G. Shedd Aquarium were built. The new landfill served as the site of the 1933 to 1934 Century of Progress Exposition, and later the 1948 Railroad Fair. After World War I, Northerly Island was offered as a site for the United Nations, then in 1947 became the site of Merrill C. Meigs Field Airport, which closed in 2003." End quote. I interviewed one of my friends whose parents were there at the time. He shared his opinions by saying the following.
My name is Jim Bodman, and I'm a friend of Christian Alexander's, and he's asked me to give him some information for a school project on the history of the Near South Side of Chicago and the Century of Progress, and Balbo, a rather flamboyant aviator who came over here for this World's Fair, for this Century of Progress, and the monument that exists in memory of him today. He was a very controversial character. The Century of Progress was an international exposition, and it was held more or less, if I'm correct, to commemorate the anniversary of the incorporation of the city of Chicago. Its theme is a statement, had to do with a plan and a purpose of the relation of the state and foreign governments to Chicago. and it was sort of an attempt to demonstrate to an international audience the nature and significance of our discovery, scientific discovery, the methods that we used to get those discovery, and the changes which their application brought in industry and the general living conditions in Chicago and in America. It was done through exhibits that appealed to the general public, and very often they were made in miniature, and there were very small replicated processes, and that which to us today is commonplace in those days was miraculous. For example, Westinghouse and General Electric were there, and they displayed their dynamos and their electrical switching devices, their fuses, their circuit boards, their circuit panels, and electrification was just beginning to reach the rural areas of America. Some large cities that even at that point still lit their lamps with whale oil. So there was much to be seen. The fair was held on about 400 acres. Most of it was landfill. On Lake Michigan. It was just south of Chicago's downtown area, kind of between Roosevelt Road, which is our 12th Street, and 39th Street, which is now Pershing Road. Today, Meigs Field, although it's been closed, and McCormick Place occupied this place. It was opened in the spring of 1933, and it was closed in the fall of that year. And although it was originally planned for the 1933 season only, it was really extended for another year. It opened up in the following spring and closed in the following fall. There are no accurate numbers that I know of to judge the number of people who attended this fair, but there were a lot, and a lot of them were farm kids who just came in to see something like this for really the first time in their lives. One of the famous displays was one of living babies in incubators. People had never seen that before. An incubator was rather new at that time. It holds a special place in my heart because my mom and dad were probably at this century of progress, although they never really spoke about it. But during the 1920s and the 1930s, there wasn't, during the late 20s and the early 30s, there wasn't much to be happy about because it was the midst of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate in the country was perhaps not right up at 25%, but it was headed up there. There were bread lines. There were people standing around begging for food all the time. Many of the expressions that we use in our common lexicon today came from that time. The one that sticks with me is "hit the bricks." Write home when I'll write home when you find work. People would just leave. They would become another word which became part of our lexicon, a hobo. There were hobo jungles. People traveled around the country on the backs of trains. During the Century of Progress, there was a very interesting event that occurred that had to do with the nation of Italy. There was an aviator by the name of Balbo, B-A-L-B-O, after whom is named the current Balbo Drive in downtown Chicago, who flew from Italy to Chicago with an armada, if you will, fleet, I guess, of 10 or 15 floating airplanes. And this was within 6 years of Charles Lindbergh first flying across the Atlantic Ocean, so it was really quite an event. Landed in Lake Michigan, and Balbo became a bit of a local hero in Chicago. He's a very dashing guy. As it turns out, he was not a very nice guy. He was the head of Mussolini's Air Force, and and had some influence in the Second World War that wasn't really very good. But he was received well, Balbo, he was received well by the people in Chicago, and so Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, he was called El Duce, gave the city of Chicago a present to commemorate the fact that Balbo had been received so well. And unfortunately, the inscription on the bottom of the base of the monument said the 11th year of the fascist era, 1934, named for Italo Balbo. And he commanded, in fact, Mussolini's Air Force. So a bunch of people didn't like the fact that fascism was mentioned on a monument that was owned by Chicago, but the city needed to do something with it because it's a beautiful column. Arguably, I don't think that anyone knows this for sure, but it is from the Roman Senate building. So you could say that Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar or any of those very well-known people at one point leaned against this thing. So Chicago has this wonderful prize, not knowing where to put it because it has this offensive remark on it. They stuck it next to where Meigs Field used to be, between Meigs Field and Soldier Field, and that's the story of Balbo. That's about all I know. That's off the top of my head, but it is a reasonably, I think, accurate description of the Century of Progress and what it was like to be around Chicago at that time.
Based upon the previously mentioned history of the Near South Side, the main population consisted of the Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians up until the Second World War. After the Second World War, African Americans moved north to find work. This pushed the population further south. Thus, the population and ethnicities in the Near South Side became more diverse, now more so than ever before. Based on the Census Bureau data, today the population of the Near South Side, area code 60616, consists of a total of 47,073 people. The two other area codes that are associated with the Near South Side are 60605 and 60607. I primarily looked at the area code 60616. Percentage-wise, here's how the ethnicities and races break down. 38.6% are Black or African American, 25.9% are white, 29.3% are Asian, 9.1% are Hispanic or Latino of any race, 4.1% are some other race, 2.4% are two or more races, 0.4% are American Indian or Alaska Native, and the last remaining 0.1% are Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. The average income for a family in 1999 was $30,625. For the U.S., it was $41,994. The median value of a house in the Near South Side of Chicago was $171,700. Based on the chart I found on the Encyclopedia of Chicago website, in the year 1930, the total population was 10,416. The white population at that time was about 75%. The Negroes were 23.8%, and other races totaled 200, or about 2%. In 1960, the total population decreased to 10,350. The white population was a mere 54 people, or 0.5%. The Negro population was 76.7%, or about 8,000, and other races totaled 2,300, or 22.7%. It is my understanding that most of the pull factors